Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 35, OpenSSH. And for those of you watching the live show, and I see the comments in already, we didn't realize when we created it, for some reason, it defaulted to PM, because I think everything should be done in military time because that would solve that problem. But seeing as that problem did occur, yes, it's actually AM when we record this. Me and Jay are both in Eastern Standard Time, so it is 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time right now.
Yep.
We could probably do a nighttime recording at some point, but we're kind of tired. Well, maybe a little tired. We're playing video games by 11. We're not in the creative mode anymore. We're all created out.
I play video games until I sleep at that point.
Yeah, we're created out sometimes by 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
We decided. Well, fun times. Let's talk about SSH is going to be the topic of today's show, and it's pretty universal, not just for Linux, but even in BSD. It's kind of how a lot of the internet is controlled now, I would say, like for all the different servers and the management. It's a really, really popular topic. There's a lot of different methodologies by which you can manage it. And it's amazing all the different things that have been bolted onto it, such as file transfers, or frequently in Ansible, you're going to use SSH and key management in order to manage fleets of machines, many firewalls, many of your higher end firewalls. This is ways you can manage them, via the command line. You're going to SSH in, and it's brands like Cisco and everybody else are using it, not just the brands built on open source platforms, open source software. So we figured it's a great topic. And what do you think? But you think we got to do a sponsor role first, though, before we get in there?
Yeah, we may as well pay the bills, right?
Got to pay the bills. And that's Linode. They've been sponsoring the show since the beginning. We love Linode. If you're listening to this podcast, it's literally how you downloaded it and got it there. The website and the infrastructure is hosted on there. Jay has many things hosted on Linode. And to tie it into today's episode, Jay manages all that with SSH. That's how we keep things up to date. We SSH in, we push all the updates and set it all up, configure it that way. Linode's been a great sponsor of the show. It's a great place to host anything that you don't want hosted on your own home lab. You get to use Linode's lab to get going. We have an offer code down below where you can get started with that. And thanks again, Linode, for sponsoring us on this. And this is definitely a great place to set up SSH, because I've got a whole video I've done on how to do like reverse proxies and stuff like that. And it's really easy using the reverse proxy system and SSH. You can tie these things together, and it's just, it's really simple. Those, it's not a scope of what we're doing today, but it's one more thing that you can throw up in Linode, throw SSH, throw proxy shells on there, and away you go. Yep. It's great. I'll leave a link to that video down in the show notes for today as well. And Jay also, we're going to talk a lot about SSH. Jay's going to take the lead on this, but I'll leave links to his videos on SSH, because Jay's done some extensive tutorials on it very recently too. So
yeah, there's a beginner's guide that's long. It's one of my longer videos. I don't remember how long. It's either 30 minutes, 60 minutes. I can't remember. I have a few that are like really long because they're like deep dives. So I have one already there. And also a video about SSH config files. The client config file just launched recently. I have like 2 more videos recorded about SSH that are coming soon. So there's going to be no shortage of content in the short term for SSH, including today's podcast. So it should be a good episode.
In SSH is one of those things. And there's also a book, Michael Lucas, SSH Mastery. Also recommend reading that. There's so much you can learn about SSH. It's a big topic. We'll just say that. All right.
It really is. It really is. So to take it from the beginning, because this is one of those topics I feel like, we probably could have covered this earlier, right? Because this is kind of like the thing you do to configure pretty much everything in your home lab. So I feel like a lot of our audience is already going to know the basics, because unless they just started a home lab today or this week, they've probably used SSH. But just to kind of take it from the beginning, it's the remote management tool of choice for pretty much every Linux and Unix user out there, because I don't know about you, but I'm not trying to drive to a data center if I'm not hosting locally, or even just go into the other room and connect a keyboard and a mouse and a monitor just to do a one-off task. I want to just log in quickly, do the thing, and then log out. And that's what SSH allows us to do. There's a client application, and then there's the server application. The client application is, as far as I know, it's installed on basically every Linux distribution. And I'm talking about the client, not the server. So that way you can connect to a server via SSH, but having the client doesn't allow anyone to connect to you. That's why it's okay to have the SSH client on your machine by default. OpenSSH, even though it's useful, is one of those things you only install if you actually plan on using it. If you, for whatever reason, have another solution and you never feel like you'll use it, then disable it, because everyone wants in via SSH, especially if it's publicly available, because a server component, once you install that and start the process, then your server or computer workstation or whatever is, accepting connections from the internet right away. So it's one of those things that you only install and set up if you need, but honestly, most of us are going to use it. I think it's safe to say probably 90% of us at this point will probably need SSH. So you probably will have it running, but again, if you have another solution, then turn it off.
Yeah, and this just goes back into your standard principles of least privilege. You don't need software on that you're not going to use. You don't need ports open. So by default, like if you saw like a Ubuntu desktop distribution, and a lot of the desktop distributions don't have SSH server running in the background by default, that's fine. If you don't need it, because you're just going to be using the UI, you can still SSH out from it. You just don't necessarily need that server running on it.
Yep. And there's some security things we'll get into as well, because I think anything that's really useful can be bastardized into something that's going to hurt us. Because if it gives us a benefit and especially convenience, and it's also potentially convenient for someone else as well. So the goal, of course, is that you want to use SSH, but you don't want like someone else that you don't even know to use it to start deleting your files or whatever. So it's a very important remote management tool, and it. Especially with the pandemic, and I hate even saying that word because, we're trying to escape from that with technology and fun Homelab things. But the reality is that more of us are working from home than ever before. So I would think it's safe to say that a lot of us are using SSH, even some people that probably weren't before. Because, if your corporate office is closed or whatever, then you're not gonna drive there to start working on your server. So SSH, you just basically use SSH as the command. It's just that simple with the IP address or host name. If the username is different, then of course you include that as well. And then you have a shell on the remote server, just like you were actually literally physically in front of it. It'd be essentially the same thing. So whatever your user has access to do, you could do from that connection, regardless of where you are versus the endpoint machine, because you can go through the internet to get to it. If it's a local machine, you can go through your LAN, and that's when you start to get creative, because you can define how you can get from point A to point B and how to make it so that other things can't sneak in too.
And from a developer standpoint, one of the things I've always found really useful in SSH, and I still use this a lot, if you take the time to build your SSH config file, or even if you're doing a one-off, being able to port forward via SSH to take ports available on an internal server, and not necessarily that you want them exposed. So I get over to that server with SSH. Then from there, I bring over some ports. I've actually demoed this when I talk about using things like SyncThing. I don't need to publicly expose that, so I can manage SyncThing remotely. Part of my SSH config file brings SyncThing and its web interface to my localhost port. And I have this configured on systems. When I SSH into them and I want to manage SyncThing, I can manage it. I can use the nice web UI to get things done in SyncThing, but then not even leave it so it's exposed at all. It's all wrapped up into SSH. And in SSH, you lock it down being key only. So now you've added one extra layer that makes it that much more difficult to get to something, but then you still have the ease of use yourself when you want to admin something such as SyncThing and pull that web port or whatever port you want to pull. And from a developer standpoint, this could be really easy, because you could just start building some of the services to run tunneled through SSH. You can tie many of them together so they bring them all to your local machine for development without having to fully expose this to the world, especially when it's in development mode.
Right. Yeah. There's an SSH is one of those things that you go down the rabbit hole of learning it. It's easy to get started. You can get started in 5 minutes, but to master it takes a long time. And to piggyback on what you said, that book is awesome by Michael Lucas, the SSH Mastery book. I read it. I didn't read the new edition though, because I know there's a new edition since the time I read it. But I think it's required reading, in my opinion. Anyone who's starting on a Linux, starting with Linux, I say get that book, or BSD, anything, because it taught me some things I didn't even know about SSH after having used it for a long time. So, and it's not a long read. It's not like this big Bible. It's like this small little book. You could probably get through it in an hour, maybe 2 hours or so. In one sitting, you just block out some time, and then by the end of that book, you'll know SSH pretty well. But we're going to cover quite a bit of the topics here. But there's some advanced topics we won't get to today, and I think some of those, if not all of those, will be covered in that book.
Yeah. You can't have too much SSH knowledge. That's what we're trying to tell you.
Yep. So
and books are good for reference too. So
yeah, it really is. So, okay, so we know what the main goal of SSH is just to get a shell on a remote system so you can run commands on that system from wherever you happen to be. But there's other things too that come along for the ride, like SCP, Secure Copy Protocol, or is it just Secure Copy? I always forget. Either way, SCP allows you to transfer files over SSH. So if you have a file you want to put on your web server, you could just SCP that file to your web server and forego FTP altogether, as you should anyway, because FTP, why? Why in 2021? Don't use FTP. SCP everything over to your server, put it in the appropriate place. You could do that via SCP. And a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually use SSH for a one-off command. You could do SSH user@myserver.com space command, could be sudo apt update, for example, whatever the command is. And it'll literally connect to that server, run that command, and disconnect. So if you want to run a one-off command, you don't even have to maintain a persistent connection. You could just literally use SSH to throw a command at a server and get the results on your screen. And I learned that a lot later in my career than I would like to admit.
And
it's one of those things.
You can also do things like you can create custom when you're building your SSH config. You can actually build commands into your SSH config files. When you SSH something, it can either execute commands on that server, or even you can create a name called like shut down the system, and you can then have it just go and execute a shutdown or a restart command on your behalf based on that. You can get really clever with it.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of clever things you could do with it. Another one that we'll actually may as well talk about it now is Sshfs, which is another one of those things that I want to say come along for the ride, but you do actually have to install on most distributions an extra package to make this work. But essentially, it gives you the ability to have a mount point, any folder that you have access to, that your user has access to on the remote server. You can literally just connect to that server and have it set up a local directory to be mounted to a remote directory, such that you can work with that directory and add files to it much in the same way that you would with CIFS or NFS or something like that. You could actually just set up a connection to a folder mount point and then do what you got to do, disconnect. And that, to me, although it's a little bit slower than NFS, it's usually easier to set up, in my opinion, because there's nothing much, if anything, to do on the remote end. Because again, any folder you have access to, you could set a mount point to that folder on from your machine to that endpoint machine. So if you're working with files, that's a great thing to do. I mean, for example, if on one of my other podcasts, I wanted to update the album art because I had new album art or podcast artwork. So I literally set up an SSHFS connection from a local folder to the uploads directory on the remote end. And using EasyTag, I hit that one folder with the album art in one shot and just updated every single file, just because, why would I want to go through and re-upload every single individual file? I just mounted that directory and worked with it as if it was a local directory, disconnected, and I was all good. So that goes back to the creativity thing, because once you learn SSHFS, which I need to do a video on anyway, and it's in my book, my latest book, it's not that hard to use. It's a powerful tool.
Yes, in when most of the Ubuntu-based distributions that I've used, it's always been you can type in sftp:// the system name, and you can just mount it right through the GNOME file system manager to get things done. A little bit of warning though, it's not going to be the fastest. So even if you have a 10 gig connection between you and a local device on a network, it won't saturate a 10 gig. There are some limitations to transferring things when it comes to just raw transfer power over it. And I bring that up because it's also the way you can set up two TrueNAS systems by default, like the next and yes options when you're setting up replication. They actually will use SSH to transfer, but when they're doing that, you'll run into some speed limitations. I've had people tell me, hey, my replications aren't working quite as fast. I'm like, yeah, if you're trying to do them all over SSH, that's a limitation. There's an advanced option to get you faster on that, where you actually use Netcat to get raw sockets open. A little outside of the topic of this, but my point is, don't expect it's not a replacement for Samba or NFS. It's not going to be where you saturate the 10 gig pipe on there. That's not going to happen. 1 gig pipes is not a problem. But once you get beyond 1 gig, SSH just has some limitations for file transfer speed. Still reliable, still secure, still solid, just it has some speed limitations.
Yeah, I agree. I would say SSHFS is really great for one-off things. Like you want to mount this directory to do some work, but you don't think you're going to need a mount to that directory ever again. You just want to set something up temporarily and then just do whatever you're going to do, then just shut down the connection when you're done. So that way you don't have to edit the FS tab file, for example, just for a one-off thing. Just use SSHFS, even though it's slower. It's not that much slower, but you'll still start to see some drawbacks in speed when you really start to hammer it. But in my case, if I'm just updating artwork in a bunch of MP3s, I mean, that's easy. So
yeah, it's got way great use cases. I just know that's a topic that's come up a few times on my channel because I talk about TrueNAS, and yes, TrueNAS uses it, but it's just a speed issue. So
exactly right. So I did a video recently about the SSH config file, which I'm going to summarize now, just so make sure everybody's aware of it. If you want more information, you can watch the video. But essentially, the SSH config file is not present by default. I mentioned that the SSH client is installed by default on every distro I've tried, but the config file for the client is not. And I'm talking about the config file that would go into your .ssh directory. Inside your home directory, it's called config, just config, inside that directory. And in there, you could put whatever host entries you want. For example, you could have a server that's on a different port, maybe because, by default, I guess I should have mentioned this first, SSH uses port 22. If you don't tell it to use a different port, then that's what it's going to use. But you could switch that port over to something else if you don't want it to be easily discoverable by bots, keeping in mind that you're still only like one port scan away from someone figuring out what port it's running on. But it's an easy change to make. It takes just a minute, and you give the SSH client the -P option with the port number, and you'll get right in. But you don't have to remember that. Especially at one point, I was using a different port number per server, which was confusing. But I actually, in my SSH config file, had all of that information in there, so I never had to memorize it, because any parameter you could put on the command line for SSH, you could put in the config file to simplify that, including username, the host name, a whole bunch of different things you can put in there. So you can watch the video, but if you find yourself typing SSH commands that are ginormous and super long, then you're probably not using the SSH config file, and you most likely should be using it.
I find it really handy, and I'm being super simple because I use SyncThing. I have a private SyncThing repository, and my SSH config file is aliased. That way it syncs on all the different systems that I use. But anytime I'm setting up a lab or a demo that I do for my videos, all the time I have two different sections of that config file that you can put little comments in or break them apart. So the bottom section is all my random test servers. But anytime I create a new random test server, if I spin one up for a demo, you spin something up in Linode and you're given an IP address, and it's where I'm going to run it. I'll call it, when I'm doing my WireGuard demos, for example, I'll call it WireGuard 1, WireGuard 2, set that up because I don't have to memorize the IP addresses. I'll put the username, the password. If I have to do some port forwarding, I'll put it all in there. It's really handy to build those files and get used to building them. It also gives you easy ways you can add names to all your servers. And by the way, something that is amusing to me and some of my staff, because we have a jump server where I have a config file as well, you can even put little icons in there. So when you SSH to free PBX, it's got the little phone icon, because yes, emoji, the Unicode, I think, or the Unicode emojis, they're supported in there. So it looks cool when you SSH into them. You don't have to remember them as long as you don't start with the emoji, as long as it's at the end. So it's like SSH free PBX, and it puts the little phone thing at the end of it because it's novel.
That's hilarious. Yeah.
I use a kangaroo for the jump box. Throw it out there.
That is brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. So I think we'll probably go back to some of the fundamentals or something, because I'm sure I missed something. But we definitely just need to talk about the security aspect of it and put some emphasis on that, because like I was explaining earlier, if you have something open to the public internet, I don't care if it's a web server, SSH, then people are going to try to hammer it. If it's a web server, then obviously you do want that accessible because you're serving a web page. So it makes sense to open that up to the world, because that's the whole point of a web server. But SSH should not be open to the world. And if it's not even running, then it's especially harder for people to use it against you if it's not even running in the first place, if not impossible. But if you're wanting to use it and it's not running, well, you can't use it yourself either. So if you want to get into the server and the SSH client, or the SSH server just goes down, there's nothing you could do about that. You have to find another way into the server to start the process. But I mean, that sounds obvious, but the reason why I bring this up is because one layer of security that's super easy to implement, if it's applicable to you, is to not have the SSH service running when you're not going to use it. So, for example, if you have a server that's remotely available in your home lab, and let's just say you go to bed at 11 at night, right? So why should your SSH service be running after 11 if you are sleeping? There's no reason for that. You could easily set up a cron job around 11 o'clock at night when you're going to bed to shut down that SSH service. And then if you wake up at 6 in the morning or something, you could have a cron job that starts the service. So that way, while you're sleeping, there's no way in. And that makes sense because unless you have nothing to do at 3 in the morning, you're probably not going to be wanting to do stuff on your server. But then the downside here is if you are managing a server for a client, then they call you in the middle of the night that their service is down and you have an SLA for 24 hours. Well, you need that SSH service running just in case you need to get in. So if there's no reason for you to ever access SSH overnight, have it shut off overnight. You can even shut off your entire server if it doesn't need to be publicly available at all. But that's just the easiest thing to do. Just don't have it running if you're not using it. That's just kind of like the first place to start. And then from there, we're going to talk about some other things that we're going to bolt on top that'll help make it more secure.
Now, one of the things that is a debate a little bit, the best way to do it is not to expose SSH to the general internet. But there are also, at the time of recording this moment, a fully patched SSH server, properly configured, fully patched. We'll put those two caveats in there. Is secure. There's not a known way to get in there. You can use things to fail to ban, or the other one that we've been testing, Jay, that is
Crowdstack.
Crowdstack. I wanted to say another crowd word that's not related. But Crowdstack, you can use tools to help, deal with and combat people hammering away at it so it doesn't waste resources and block them. But overall, you can expose it. It's still preferred, like anything, wrap it up in a VPN. So you've made it a little bit harder to discover the services on there. But you can expose it on there. But there are properly configured being the caveat. Jay's going to dive into a little what a properly configured SSH server looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. And, when it comes to SSH, it's just, you're right. One of the things is, if it's fully patched, then generally speaking, you're good, right? Because SSH itself is pretty secure. The only thing to keep in mind is if your password sucks, then it's definitely, someone's going to get in for sure. I don't care if you have all the patches or not. But the thing is, if your password is monkey123, and you have no other protections in place at all, then it's only a matter of time. So obviously you have to use some common sense here and don't have it. Actually, as we'll talk about shortly, having password authentication enabled at all is a bad idea. Right. But if you do have to have it enabled, then at least have a really long password that's randomly generated. That just makes sense, right? So one thing that you could also do, but this is going to be a very limited subset of our audience, though, because I think the majority of Homelab users are going to have residential internet. So that means they probably don't have a static IP. If you do have a static IP to your cable modem or your internet device, then you could make it such that the firewall only accepts SSH connections from that IP, meaning your local internal IP. So you could actually have a VPN service to get yourself into your network, and then you could SSH into whatever, or just leave it off altogether. Leave off the public access altogether and just use VPN. But at the very least, if you do have a static IP, then you could actually use that to kind of firewall what can access that. But with residential internet, you don't really know what your public IP is going to be, tomorrow, let alone an hour from now. So that is probably something a lot of people can't do.
Right.
Yep. So going further from there, because, just starting from the bottom, working our way up, I talked about password authentication being bad. And that means if you can SSH into your server, with no configuration change, it's just going to ask you for your password. You type it in, you're connected. But if you can get a password prompt, then so can someone else, possibly. So they'll just keep trying passwords over and over again. But if you disable passwords, then, okay, you can't type a password if you're not prompted for one. But how do you get into it? That's when you set up SSH Public Key Authentication, where you have a public key and a server key, or a public key and a private key. And what that allows you to do is connect via public key authentication. And then once you know that works, you could shut off password authentication altogether. So if someone doesn't have that actual SSH key, then they're not able to get into the server. And that's going to increase your security tenfold just by doing that alone. That's the best thing you could do of anything on the list, aside from shutting down SSH altogether. Public key authentication, in my opinion, should be mandatory. It should be something that you're walked through when you set up SSH on everything, and everything should just default to have the password being disabled. But we're not quite there yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, the nice thing is once you do that, I imagine there's probably even some bots that quit wasting time with those. They're like, oh, it's whatever. They're not going to try random key. Once you go for a key-based authentication, you dive into how that works and looking into cryptography. It's a rabbit hole, but boy, you'll understand why that works so well with key-based. Once you have a good secure cryptographic key, it's one, really convenient because you can just log in. It's often key managed authentication is how you'll use tools like Ansible, so you're not trying to type a password to all the machines. But the other side of it too, just the level of simplicity that gives and peace of mind, because those cryptographic keys, provided you don't lose your private keys, that recently happened in the news. Someone accidentally sent a private key out an accident instead of a public one, a very large place over in Europe. But anyways, that does happen. As long as you don't lose track of your private keys, they're solid. You can publicly list your public side of the key. So,
and if your key does leak out, hopefully you have a process in place to withdraw that key from all your servers. But also, I'm hoping that you set up a passphrase on that key, because is it possible somebody could use the key with a passphrase and get your passphrase? Of course, it's possible, but unlikely. If they don't have the passphrase, they can't unlock the key to use it. They can have the key. And in my opinion, even if you have like a really crazy long passphrase that nobody will be able to guess, it's randomly generated or whatever, the fact is, if your key leaks, you should still, get that off of all your servers and never trust it again if that private key were to leak. But at the very least, you have a layer of protection that'll slow them down, if nothing more, that they don't have that passphrase, they can't use the key. So when it asks you to set up a passphrase, it's basically like you're putting in a password to use the key, which is exactly what it is. It's similar to entering a password to get into the server, but it's not a password for the server. It's a password to unlock the key to get to the server. And that's another thing I feel is pretty much mandatory. And, some people feel like SSH keys, one of the best things about them is you're automating your connection. You just SSH server and you're done, you're in. Your key gets you right in there. But if you put a passphrase on there, you're entering a password every time, which some people say defeats the purpose, because you're using an SSH key in getting around passwords. But that's not why you're using an SSH key. It's not to get around passwords like so many people think. Yes, you can do that. The whole point of an SSH key is to strengthen your connection. So definitely have a passphrase, because why not? It's just another layer of protection. And you could cache that passphrase with the SSH agent locally, so you're not putting that in like 15 times during the day. You could cache it for a certain amount of time on your local client, and then you'll just get right in until that session expires or whatnot. So I definitely recommend everyone use a passphrase, and there's more information about that in a lot of my videos, actually. I think it's something I covered several times.
Yeah, and kind of related is, what about hardware keys like YubiKey or any of those? Yeah, those are a good idea as well. One thing to be certain of, and me and Jay at some point we'll dive into that topic probably on the Homelab show here, is hardware token keys. One thing, if you're using YubiKey, is make sure you get a pair of them, because if you tie authentication to a YubiKey and you don't know what you did with it, that can be a problem. So just if you're ordering one, you don't order a YubiKey, you should always have YubiKeys that you set up. One goes in some well-protected place, maybe a safe deposit box, wherever you think is a good place to put it. And then you use the other one, but that way you have a plan B. If you go, I don't know where that went, or someone tries to wander off with it, you don't suddenly become also denial of service yourself by not being able to get in anything.
Right. Absolutely. And so earlier you mentioned trying to blank. Oh, fail to ban. I almost lost the word there. Fail to ban and Crowdstack. So those aren't specific to SSH, but they do protect SSH. Now, there was a tool called DenyHost a long time ago that was dedicated to SSH, but last time I checked, it's no longer maintained, so we can't use it. But fail to ban, what that does is it watches a service for failure. So it looks at your log file. So if you have, for example, a web server running Apache, and you configure it to look at Apache to see if someone's trying to hammer it and get in. And then what fail to ban will do is, if they see that activity, or if it sees that activity, it's going to add them to the block list, which is essentially creating a firewall rule. Now, by default, it might be like a 4-hour ban. But if you think about it, though, if someone is only able to try 5 times, and then they're banned for 4 hours, that slows them down a lot, like orders of magnitude slower. So if they're trying to brute force a server, it's going to take them a lot longer. It's no longer worthwhile unless it's an extreme targeted attack. At that point, they just won't have time. I mean, it just years or centuries will pass before they could try every single password. And by default, fail to ban will protect SSH. It'll look at your SSH log files, look for attempts. I want to say it's 5 by default, 5 attempts. I could be wrong. It might be 7. And if it sees that many number of attempts in a window of time, it's just going to add that IP address to the block list, or the firewall rather. And then that person is going to have to go find something else to do, because they're probably not going to get into that server anytime soon.
Yeah. Those are, like I said, this little things like that. And also you should have alerting on. If you have those things, if it's public facing is one thing, don't turn alerting on to yourself, because you'll drive yourself nuts because there's so much noise of hammering on them. But they're also good to have on internal servers, because the same thing. If suddenly inside of your network, something is constantly trying to log in, one, you should be alerted of it, but two, stopping it from doing it so it doesn't keep guessing is also very valid, very valid to have on. So it's not something just for public facing only. It's good practice to have this internally set up, because you want to know if something all of a sudden this random device is on my network. One, where'd it come from? And two, why is it trying to log into things that it normally doesn't log into?
Yep. And I also would say, if you have logging enabled or alerting enabled, you absolutely should change the port number that the SSH server is listening on, because you're going to minimize the amount of log entries tenfold. You'll still have some noise. You'll still have people trying. But if you have it on the default of port 22, I mean, if you change it to another port, it doesn't really secure you all that much better. It's not really that much of a protection. It's just easy to do. But when you do change that port number, you'll have fewer people trying, because you'll have a bunch of bots that are trying port 22 on every IP address out there, including yours. And they're going to keep trying over and over again. So you'll get alerts like all day long, literally all day long. But if you change the port number, then you're going to have a lot fewer attempts. Maybe you won't see any in a given day, but you might see 1 or 2, but it'll definitely be a lot less chatty, so to speak, because you'll have it on a different port. Someone sees, oh, he or she doesn't have port 22 open, so okay, I'll move on to this other server before I try like all the other ones, because they're just looking for an easy grab or an easy get, low-hanging fruit, basically.
And for fun, go ahead and leave port 22 with a honeypot on it.
Yeah, I mean, you could literally, I'm not saying everyone should do this, but I have once. I guess do as I say, not as I do, right? I set up a server on Linode one time, and I only needed it for like 10 minutes, or no, I think it was like a day. And I was working on a tutorial, and something came up. It's life, right? That happens. So I had to pause the recording, and I go do a thing, and I don't get back to it until the next day. But meanwhile, I had this server running overnight. It was already owned. I just had a weaker password, because my mindset was like, I'm never going to use this server for anything. Nothing important's ever going to go on it. But I had an email from Linode. By the way, there's some crypto mine or some kind of traffic coming from this instance. I'm like, oh crap, because they're watching this kind of thing. But that as it may, it's just, if you have a password that's not very complex and you have password authentication enabled, you just leave it running. They're going to hammer it. It's just the way it is. Unfortunately, It's called what'd you call it? Like background internet radiation, I think.
Yeah, it's just the background radiation of the internet. I think Steve Gibson was one I first heard him say that. I know he says a very accurate way. There's just this persistent noise on the internet poking at things. There's always some server in some closet that no one's ever gonna reboot or shut down until it basically dies. Therefore, it's infected with 20-year-old, and to think it actually could be running still with some 15 or 20-year-old malware just poking at the internet looking for friends.
So change the port number. I mean, you may as well do it. It's still not going to help you much, but it'll cut the radiation down a little bit, cut the noise down, make the log files a lot of lines fewer. I think I saw one log file get to like 13,000 lines at one point when password authentication was enabled. So when I say that people are going to be trying it a lot, I'm not joking here. Like literally thousands of times people are going to be trying to hammer it and get in there. So you could literally set up a server and just tail the authentication logs for like 5 minutes as soon as you set it up, and you'll see people trying to get in. It actually freaked me out the first time I saw it in my career when I was new. Oh my God, we're under attack. That's what I literally thought when I saw all those attempts. And I'm like, learn now, that's just the way it goes, unfortunately. But you still got to protect your server as best you can.
Yep, absolutely.
So when it comes to security, fail to ban is definitely a given. To kind of summarize here, change the port number. That's a good idea. Allow users is a good idea too, because that allow groups even. That allows you to do what it says. Basically, lock it down to just your username and your group membership or whatever. So that'll help stop people that are trying like every known username, root, admin, or whatever. You can just have your username. It, again, doesn't help a ton, but it's just you layer these security layers together, and eventually things get to be a lot more secure. So UFW being installed is a great thing because you could firewall something to a specific IP address. Fail to ban will ban people that try over and over again to get in. Add public key authentication, get that working with a passphrase. Then you disable password authentication altogether. Use allow users, allow groups to lock it down there. And just keep layering these things on top of each other, even going as far as shutting off SSH during times it's never, ever, ever going to be used because you sleep, like most of us. Then you could just have that off and then have it start back up, obviously. So that's something you could do as well. And the more the better, right? Hardware keys, YubiKeys, buy a couple of those. We'll be covering those in a future episode. I bought a bunch of them actually recently to do a refreshed video because the one I did was kind of old. I'm not really recommending people watch it at this point, although it's probably still valid. I will be refreshing that. I want to say probably December, maybe as late as January, but I'm not sure what the timeline is yet. But I'm working it out right now, so we should be seeing that fairly soon.
And one more thing, this is just kind of when practical, so I'll say to do this. I can't say it's a hard yes to do, but don't log in as root. Log in as another user and then sudo your way up to the privilege level you need. This way,
right?
They have one less piece of information. What is the username you're using to guess at this? Well, obviously, root is pretty much always going to be tried. And I say when practical because there's some things that are made to be admin by root by design, different appliances and things like that. So it's not like an automatic everything has to have a separate username. But when you're building a Linux server, easy enough. And I believe in even the Ubuntu servers and Debian, I think it all comes in with root disabled by default in the SSH. So you log in as a user and then privilege escalate yourself. That makes one more layer of security. So that's another little important aspect. It's not necessarily directly SSH, but it is related to the SSH config file because prohibit root is by default on a lot of installations.
Yep, that's right. Ubuntu uses the cloud images will use the user Ubuntu by default. If you install it yourself, you create your own user account. Root is disabled by default on all Ubuntu, with the exception of some cloud providers. They sometimes will use root, but if that's the case, that means you use root just long enough to configure SSH, you lock it down and delete root access via SSH. Just turn that off. So that's an important thing to do as well. Now, when it comes to Debian, it's a little interesting because whether that the root account is locked out or not depends on how you install it. And this is another one of those things I didn't really notice till later in my career, because it'll ask you for a root password, basically. My understanding, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've done this because I have automation in place. So it's been a while since I've done anything manually. But if you don't actually add a root password when it asks you, it's going to lock down root on Debian. And then then when you create the normal user, you'll have sudo access. You can do whatever. But if you give it a root password, it's going to allow root. So you want to make sure that you just know that, first of all. You can have the root account if you want it. Just don't allow it via SSH. But just don't fill in that information when it asks you the installer, but fill in the information for the normal user. Then your normal user becomes the sudo user that can do those administrative tasks on Debian. And some spins of Debian, like Crunchbang, for example, Crunchbang++, that, if I remember correctly, defaults to just a standard user and no root account enabled. So yeah. Aside.
You can also, and I'll mention like GitHub. I have my public SSH keys in GitHub. And one of the things when you're installing a Ubuntu server, it'll ask you your GitHub username. And I can punch in my GitHub username, and then it will go ahead and pull my keys down and throw them in and disable password authentication right from the setup of it. So during installation, and this can go a little further, a lot of different cloud tools will allow you to do this. So as it spins up servers, I believe like Linode has this, you can put your public SSH keys in. So when it spins servers, they're already installed. This can also be done with Cloud Init. I'm correct. No, Jay's the CloudNet expert, not me. But yeah, as far as no CloudNet,
no.
well,
I think the only people that are an
it.
expert are the ones that made it. But I've went through the rabbit hole of CloudNet because it's not as well documented as some of the things. I mean, their documentation on their site is nice, but I made the tutorials just because they needed to exist, and it was kind of a big deal to take that on. But it's a cool service nonetheless. But when it comes to troubleshooting, though, that's something we should talk about too. But we could probably keep this section short because it very much depends on the situation. But when I'm teaching people in person, like when I used to work at a physical location, like I would teach people the basics of SSH when they join the company. I would get the same complaint from each of them, which is like every time SSH fails and I can't get in, I don't get any information as to why it fails, or I get very limited information about why it fails. And it makes it hard for them to figure out what's going wrong. And that's basically the pain point I think everyone goes through that learns this. And I'm not sure if this is 100% accurate. It's just a theory, but I'm pretty sure it's true. I mean, they don't give you information about why it failed, because the more information they give you, the more a bad person could use that information to know why it's not working, to find a way around it to get into the server. So to give the client as little information as possible is often like security through obscurity. It's just not giving you that information. So you can still get that information. And one thing that you can do is, if you can't get into the server, you can tail the log, or someone else can tail the log, or whoever can get into the server could tail the log. Or you could go into your web console if it's a cloud provider and tail follow the var log auth.log if it's Debian and Ubuntu, for example. I think it's var log secure on others, and have that tail follow going. And then on the client, try to get in, and you'll see on the server side of things, generally speaking, the reason why you can't get in, it'll say something about your SSH key not having the right permissions, for example, which is not going to tell you that on the client side of things. But if you're tailing the log on the server side of things, you could find your answer real quick. Oh, it's just the permissions. Then you can get that information in a minute. But if you didn't know to look for it there, then you could probably try easily an hour Googling like crazy trying to figure this out. And that's what kind of, I guess, gets a lot of people that are starting out, because they don't really know that. So just get in the habit of using tail-f and then whatever the log file is for authentication on your Linux server. And you can do that through the web console if you can't get in, and then try to get in through the client, and then you'll see the errors just show up right there on the server side of things. And then you can figure out why it's not working and fix the problem.
And you can get a lot of insight on the client side by going SSH-VV, two V's, to get more detail. It's also kind of cool because you can watch what's going on. It'll tell you the back and forth, what it tried, what the different key types that it tried are. It's kind of it's a nice back and forth learning experience for how SSH negotiates the connection.
Yeah. So if you're saying, like, if you don't have like password authentication disabled, for example, and you do have keys set up, but you don't disable the password, then you try it. Basically what's going to happen if it's working is, if the key is working, you'll just get right in. But if you're prompted for a password, that means it tried the key, it didn't like it, now it's asking for the password as the next step. So with the SSH-VV, you can see that it says, oh, I'm trying this key name, I'm trying that key name, and it tries a bunch of them. And then it doesn't think that any of the keys are appropriate. Then it asks for the password. Oh, it's a key issue. That's why I need to figure that out. On the server side of things, it might complain about the permissions. On the local client side of things, you can see it cycling through all the keys. It's not happy, something it doesn't like. And you can pretty much figure out exactly what it is. If it's a client issue altogether, then that's especially where the -VV option will shed some light on that.
Yeah, one of the things, if you're making SSH keys, one of the things you have to do, especially with your private key, is make sure it's not set to like global readable.
Right.
And that's a weird SSH problem you run into. I created keys, Tom, but I can't get into there. Well, if you do a -VV, it'll tell you that they're publicly readable and therefore they won't be used. So there's little things that the client side will cause problems. And it's just quick, take the time, read the error message.
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, there's so many other topics that we can cover, but I think that since we have like the basics of SSH, we could just segue into other things, later on in the life of the podcast, just the different types of things you could tack on to SSH. We didn't even talk about SSH certificates, for example. That's another thing we can add to it at another time. Yeah. So there's a lot of things about it, but knowing the basics first, we're covering that today, so that way we can build on that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay's got a whole video on there where he dives deeper into this topic, because we can't really represent here all the visual aspects of learning, like configuring the host file, looking at its structure. It's the structure is host, the name, the host name, user root, local forwards, if you have them in there, identity files you want to use. But you kind of need to get those spaced properly, and it's easier to show that visually. And we have separate videos where we talk about that. I believe I have videos on SSH. Jay has videos on SSH. We'll leave some of those out in the show notes, because that's where you can visually go through and really dive deeper into those.
Yep. And there's more SSH goodness coming on my channel within the next couple of weeks. So definitely subscribe, and you can watch the ones I have now and also the ones that are coming.
And get that book by Michael Lucas. So SSH Mastery, OpenSSH Putty Tunnels and Keys. And there was some comments earlier when I posted about the book, was the artwork by Michael Lucas is great. So I'll throw a link to that book in the show notes as well. So
I think it's required reading easily.
Yeah. And I'll throw it one more time in the chat. It's really easy to find. I don't think there's any other book with the title. So I just typed in Google SSH Mastery and it came right up. So easy one to find. And Michael Lucas is awesome. I actually have an interview with Michael Lucas, man. He's a prolific book writer when it comes to tech, and his books are quite enjoyable. So
they really are. He's really good.
He's, if there's a frequent guest we have shouted out on here, it would have, guest that was on my channel. I think we should probably have him on the Homelab show sometime, but it's definitely Michael Lucas. He's definitely a gem of a person. He happens to be local to me and Jay, so we got to meet him in a few events, but definitely fun. And when we brought him up, we had Wendell on a few episodes ago. As soon as we mentioned Michael Lucas, Wendell reached behind him and pulled out like a stack of Michael Lucas books.
Yeah, I really admire the fact that he's self-publishing.
Yes.
Which, in my opinion, even though I'm a hypocrite for saying this, but in my opinion, that's the better way to go. Self-publishing for sure. Because
the harder way to go is why you didn't do it.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's an ADD thing, I think, too, because sometimes having a deadline over me helps me a lot, because it's like, oh, I have to get it done by that date. I have to get these chapters in by these dates, and I'm going to definitely do that. But in the absence of those dates, I'll probably procrastinate, unfortunately. So if Michael Lucas can do it, you know what? That's the best way to do it. I really admire the fact he's able to do that.
Yeah, he pulls it off. He's a lot of fun.
Yep.
You can follow him on Twitter if you just want to see his musings as well. He can also just be entertaining in general. So all right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and talk to you next time. Take care.
Thank you, guys.